So let's now dig a bit deeper, and let's start with variables, constants, and properties. How should these be named? We can differentiate between three main kinds of values which are being stored in them. Our values could be objects, and this includes lists or maps or any other more complex data structure. Our value could be a simple number or string, or our value could be a boolean. And you can already tell by the color coding here that there seems to be a difference between booleans and the other kinds of values. Now, if your value, which you store in a variable, constant, or property, is an object or an object-like thing, then the name which you assign to your variable or property should simply describe the value. So if you are storing a user object in your variable, name the variable user. If you are storing an object which describes a database and offers database operations, you might want to name the variable database. If your value is a number or a string, so some text, then you also just want to describe the value. If you have a variable that holds the name of a user, you might just want to call it name. The same, of course, if it's a property in a user object. If you have a variable or property which holds an age, you might want to call it age, just like that. Now for booleans, there is a special case. For booleans, your name should simply be a question that can be answered with true or false. So you might name your variable something like isActive or logged in, because that can be yes or no, and therefore true or false. You are active or you are not. It's a either or choice. So for booleans, we want this is something naming or names like logged in, which also can be answered with yes or no. Now you might want to consider providing more details and more information where it makes sense, but you don't want to introduce extra redundancy. For example, if your user in a certain branch of your code is always an authenticated user, you could consider naming that variable authenticated user to make it really clear to everyone who reads that code that you're only acting on an authenticated user here. If it's a customer, you could name it customer instead of user to have this more specific name. If it's a SQL database, you could use that as a name to make it really clear which kind of database you are working on. If you store just the first name of a user in a certain field, you might want to name it first name instead of just name to be more specific about the kind of name being stored in there. On the other hand, I would argue that age is already pretty specific, so you probably can't be more specific there. So it's not about making your names as long as possible, but just about making them as clear and as easy to understand as possible. And sometimes shorter is better, sometimes longer is better. Obviously, this is also something which will come with experience, but also with help of the demos and exercises you will see throughout this course. Now for booleans, it's the same. You can add more details if it makes sense. For example, if isActive refers to a user, you could name it isActiveUser. Logged in, on the other hand, will typically always refer to a user. So for example, using user is logged in instead of just logged in is longer, but not necessarily better.